What happens when a top politician dies in a fiery plane crash? It sparks some really urgent questions, not just about who takes over, but about the very systems we all count on to be safe. Today, we're going to break down the investigation into the crash that killed Maharashtra's Deputy Chief Minister, Ajit Pawar, and what it tells us about power, politics, and safety in India. The date, January 28th, 2026. A day that started out like any other for most people in the Indian state of Maharashtra. And the location? Baramati Airport. Now, for one of the state's most powerful men, Ajit Pawar, this small airfield was literally his backyard, his home turf. But what should have been a totally routine landing, well, it turned into a national tragedy, a moment that threw both politics and public safety into a total tailspin. All right, so let's get right into it. The crash itself, the fatal landing that basically stopped the country in its tracks. So here's what we know for sure, right from the get-go from the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, the DGCA. The who? Maharashtra's Deputy Chief Minister, Ajit Pawar. The what? He was on a chartered Learjet 45 that went down on landing. The where? His home turf, Baramati Airport. And the outcome? Just devastating. No survivors. Now, you can imagine, in a situation this huge, this political, rumors start flying everywhere. So the biggest question becomes, how do you actually find out what happened? How do you get to the truth when there's so much noise? So that brings us to the process. How exactly do they investigate something like this? Well, believe it or not, there's a very specific playbook, a forensic blueprint that kicks in every single time there's a crash in India. And it's all about one thing, finding answers to prevent it from happening again. Okay, so you've got two main players here, and you really need to know the difference between them. First is the DGCA, the regulator. They're the first boots on the ground, securing the site, coordinating everything. But the real deep dive, the forensic stuff, that's the AIIB, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau. And this is key. They're independent. That's so important because you don't want the regulator investigating itself, right? They're the ones who analyze the black box and figure out the real cause. And the AIIB's investigation follows this really logical six-step process. First things first, lock down the scene, grab all the evidence. Then you piece it all together to build a timeline, a second-by-second account of what went wrong. Only then can you figure out the why, not just the surface-level cause, but the deep, root problems. The last part? Make recommendations for change and write it all up so everyone can learn from it. And it's really not just a one-and-done thing. Think of it like a loop, a cycle of continuous improvement. What they learn from one crash gets fed right back into the system to make flying safer for all of us. But look, figuring out the nuts and bolts of the crash, that's only half the story. To really get why this was such a massive deal, you have to understand the man himself, Ajit Pawar, and the crazy political world he lived in. Yeah, Ajit Pawar wasn't just any politician. He was royalty in a political dynasty. And just a couple of years before this crash, he did something unthinkable. He blew it all up, staging a rebellion that put him head-to-head with his own family, led by his legendary uncle, Sharad Pawar. And this whole split, it happened so fast it gave everyone whiplash. You could feel the tension building in April 2023. By late June, the deal was done. And then, bam, July 2nd, he's taking the oath as deputy CM in the rival government. Less than a year later, the Election Commission basically handed him the keys to the kingdom, the official party name and symbol. And if you want to see just how successful his rebellion was, just look at these numbers. It's wild. He took a whopping 77% of the party's state lawmakers with him. I mean, he basically owned Maharashtra. Meanwhile, his uncle Sharad held onto the party's power in the national parliament. So you had this crazy split. Ajit ran the state, and Sharad ran the party nationally. Now, the official story, which you heard from his cousin Supriya Saleh, was all about ideological differences. And sure, maybe, but let's be real, everyone knew it was a mix of raw ambition, different strategies, and Ajit wanting to carve out his own massive piece of the pie in state government. So when Ajit Pawar died so suddenly, it wasn't just like taking a queen off the chessboard. It created this huge power vacuum. It threw everything up in the air, the future of his faction, and maybe the entire Pawar dynasty. All right, so to get what happens next, you need a quick who's who of the family. You've got the patriarch, Sharad Pawar, and his daughter Supriya, who's basically his heir apparent on the national stage. Then you have Ajit's sons, Parth and Jay, who now carry his legacy. And don't forget another cousin, Rohit Pawar, who actually stuck with Sharad during the big split. And this is the million-dollar question that has everyone in politics talking. Does this horrible tragedy actually bring the family back together? A garwapsi or homecoming, like they say? Or does it just kick off a brand new rivalry, pitting Ajit's sons against their cousins, Supriya and Rohit? The entire future of the NCP is literally hanging on this. But okay, let's zoom out for a second. Because this story is so much bigger than one family or one political party. What this crash really does is it shines a super bright and honestly pretty uncomfortable light on some of the growing pains in India's entire aviation industry. You have to understand, the context here is just explosive growth. India's aviation market is blowing up. It's one of the fastest growing in the world. And a huge part of that is connecting all these smaller regional towns and cities. More planes, more flights, more people in the air than ever before. Okay, but here's the catch. All that growth is putting a ton of pressure on the smaller airports, exactly like the one in Baramati. We're talking places with shorter runways, older landing systems, and honestly, not enough emergency services right there on site. They're getting busier and busier, but the infrastructure just hasn't caught up. And this crash, it also puts the whole world of private charter planes under a microscope. It's a booming business, for sure, but it sometimes feels like it operates in a bit of a regulatory gray area. You hear these concerns about safety checks not happening as often, or pilots being pressured by tight VVIP schedules, flying very, very important people around. It all happens without the kind of intense public watchdoggery that big commercial airlines get. And that leaves us with this one final, really critical question. The Baramati crash is a terrible story. It's about political loss and personal tragedy, but it's also a wake-up call. As India's ambition is taking off, soaring higher and higher, the biggest question of all is, can its safety infrastructure on the ground actually keep pace?